Hi, this is Alex Bryant, President, founder of East West Associates. I appreciate you all taking the time. We've got a large number of people that are signed up today for this event. We wanted to go ahead and get started if we could. Today's comments are specifically around global supply chain and the optimization of global supply chain, evaluating China's role in the overall global supply chain. The reason we're doing the webinar is a number of manufacturing companies are under pressure, and to evaluate their China supply chain and light specifically of the current economic environment going on and tariffs, rising labor rates, etc. A number of the board of directors, executives, investors of a number of companies are concerned about the overweight of China in their supply chain, in their overall manufacturing footprint. Today is going to focus on the supply chain and how companies are looking at China and how they're also looking at Asia Pacific. They're looking at Mexico. A lot of the companies here will be focused only in China for China, so what they can do to restructure their supply chain on the ground in China. As we move forward today, we're going to have we will have a full discussion on East West. We're going to have a discussion about how companies are looking at this. Then we've got 4 case studies at the end, and we're going to focus on those 4 case studies operating. And these are case studies we've done for manufacturers recently in this year. Here at East West, we won't spend much time on this, just to let you know the core practice of East West. So all the team members we've got in East West have all had P&L responsibilities and run companies in China, Asia, Mexico, and Central Eastern Europe. Here, the list of our focus. Today, we're going to focus on supply chain optimization, performance improvement, and manufacturing footprint optimization. Here are the photos. Well, we're not a very attractive group of people. We do know what we're doing. So let's now kind of go ahead and get started. I think at this point, real briefly, I'd ask Mark Plum to give about a 30-second background on him, and then to ask Dan to do the same. Mark, if you would kick us off.
Sure. Thank you, Alex. Yeah, sure. My name is Mark Plum, and as Alex mentioned, all of us have had a lot of experience. I lived in Asia for over 25 years and spent my last 14, 15 years as president of Briggs & Stratton in Asia, headquartered in Shanghai with operations from Japan to Indonesia. So pretty good background on manufacturing and running top line businesses in Asia.
Thank you, Mark. Dan, would you mind giving a brief background?
Sure. Dan McLeod. My background is primarily in operations management, engineering management, manufacturing. Worked primarily in the chemical industry, but also in food processing and electrical components manufacturing. 21 years in Asia, about 13 of that in China, 7 in Singapore, covering all of Asia, Southeast Asia, and the rest of Asia, and then a year in the Philippines. So more than half of my career in Asia.
That's great. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Mark. Okay, sure. I'm going to turn it over to Mark now. Mark, we're going to go ahead and get started on the background and kind of why we're here, and then let's tune into the background of why we're here, and then we'll get into the case studies at a later point. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Alex. Yeah. Again, I'll give a little background of how, as Alex said, how we got where we are. A lot of us went to China 20, 25 years ago, even before WTO, and then of course WTO in 2000. 20 years ago, and we went there for basically a couple reasons. Of course, lower labor costs, as well as a large untapped domestic market with very little local suppliers. So labor costs about 12 years ago began to rise, as we all know, and then what happened after that, a few years later, after regulatory concerns popped up. For example, we weren't able to do as many things in China as easily as we could before, as they began to put in other regs. Then after about 5, 6, 10 years of manufacturing and moving factories to China, local copy guys, intellectual property got lost a little bit. Some of our operations managers went and opened their own companies, and all of a sudden now a market that didn't have domestic competition now does have domestic competition. So our costs have gone up. We have more regs, and now we have got domestic competition. And then in around 2008 or so, the market slowed, and so then that put more pressure on those of us doing business in China, where 25 years ago it was pretty easy, and now again 12 years ago to the present time it's been becoming more difficult. Then of course with Xi Jinping starting about 5 years ago, he initiated kind of a 2025 Buy China initiative. It's really kind of a non-tariff barrier protectionism, where a lot of companies are encouraged to buy a local supplier if that exists versus an imported or a third-party manufactured company. And then of course 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, those of us that were there building a lot of stuff and shipping it back to the States, we all know what happened with tariffs and additional 25% on top of things. So that really became, now we got 6 things that have changed dramatically. And then now, since March, COVID, and what's COVID done to us is the fact that we can't travel there to continue to work with our companies, and our managers can't travel back here for additional training. So the long and short of it is, the last 12 years, the market's gone from going there 25 years ago, very inexpensive, low labor, no competition, pretty wide open, to a market now that is much more difficult. And as we say internally, this COVID might be the finally the straw that broke the camel's back. So big change in the last 12 years. So enough is enough, right? So a recent survey conducted by the global supply chain specialists of over 600 supply chain specialists said that 90% believe they have to do something different in the future in China. 73% believe they have to look outside and develop other strategies for their supply chain. 67% believe that this is going to be the biggest challenge that they face in their business careers, and 21% believe they have the expertise, or said differently, 79% believe they don't have the expertise to go about how do they mitigate and some of their risks, be it manufacturing and supply chains in China. Next slide, please, Alex. So today's presentation is dedicated to helping companies overcome these things. But it gets very confusing, and that is because there is so much information out there telling us what you should do. You should stay in China. You should leave China. You should have China plus one. The Wall Street Journal, all the publications, all the articles, and so some of it is good that you get. It gives you the advantage of having all this information is a good overview of what's going on. The disadvantage, of course, is there's so much. It's lack of clarity. What do I do? What path do I follow? So we're going to try to cut this down so we can decide programs that best fit you. Next slide, please, Alex. Okay, so just again a little bit more information. UBS says 76% of the firms say you need to consider moving out of China. Forbes says many people are looking at rethinking their supply chains to avoid tariffs by opting out of China. Okay, so those two guys are saying maybe you should leave China. Our third annual survey of over 200 East-West survey, that is, of over 200 manufacturers and/or suppliers who have operations in China, basically 51% are saying they need to look for additional sources outside of China or relocation. But 43% say, no, we need to restructure in China because we're in China for China. So, again, what do you do? Do you leave? Do you stay? Right? Next slide, please. So some of the advantages, publications talk about, the focus on the reasons for moving out of China. Well, you can move to maybe higher growth areas, ASEAN, Association of Southeast Nations. You can expand your logistics infrastructure. Maybe you can go find lower labor costs and tax structures that would encourage you to be leaving China. But other publications say you should stay in China. You got an established customer base. You got a huge market. You've got growing global influence. You've got an economic growth, maybe in China, that's more than the domestic. Excuse me, guys. Others say advantages of moving out of China is risk diversification. You can reduce your cost. You can have higher growth. But also there's challenges if you leave China. And this is where it gets really, really difficult. You leave established supplier networks, and you've been developing these networks for 20, 25 years. You have to replicate China's well-developed transportation infrastructure, logistics, capacity, and scale. We all know the rails, the roads, the ports, the airports are phenomenal. In China, they've all been built in the last 25 years. And then what happens if you move? Highly likelihood of business disruptions. So again, do you stay or do you move? Next slide, please, Alex. A lot of options, and they're all right. Every one of them is right depending on your situation. But what's the right approach for you, for your company? So what East West does, and this is, I think, because of the fact that we've all been doing this on the ground in Asia for 20, 25 years. First thing you have to have is the right plan for you and your company. And again, that's the assessment. This isn't this, everything doesn't fit for everybody. If you're in China for China, then you need to help you fix your problems in China. If a lot of your business is outside of China, maybe you look outside of China for your suppliers. So again, and then do you look, you can look at staying in China. We can help you with Asia, Mexico, Central European. So the long and short of it is you have to assess your situation clearly, first of all, and then you have to have the right implementation to make sure you can manage specifically what the assessment says you ought to be doing. Next slide, please, Alex. So Dan's going to pick it up from here, but we're going to talk about the right plan for your company begins with an assessment of your company. Dan?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so when we talk about an assessment process, really we want to start broadly. We want to neck it down and bring it to specific recommendations for your company. We start with an assessment of your company's current state. We want to understand what your business is. We want to understand what you manufacture, what you purchase, where your supplier base is, what your manufacturing footprint looks like, and strengths, what the future project prospects for your business is as far as which areas are growing, which areas may be shrinking, and understand that. And then do a deeper dive into your current supply chain, looking at, again, your manufacturing footprint, your production capacities, where your suppliers are, your supplier performance, logistics processes, inventory holdings. Get deep into what your current state is, and then do some benchmarking and comparisons into what we would consider to be sort of standard metrics and common KPIs for the industry. And from that, do an analysis and develop recommendations for a future state, options to pursue, track work streams to pursue to improve your overall supply chain cost and performance, and then be able to present a range of options to you to decide on how to go forward. Next slide, Alex. And again, on the company overview, many of the things that we would consider, we want to go deep. What's your competitive landscape, the scale of your business versus your competitors, changes in technology or markets that could be driving trends, manufacturing and supply chain strategies. Are there indications that there's geographic shift in either customer base or supplier base? Have you been pursuing a global strategy for sourcing and supply chain, or versus multiple regional supply chains? Tariffs, as we mentioned, the last 3 years have been a huge issue for U.S. companies or companies that are importing into the U.S. or exporting into China. A significant driver on costs. And on the flip side of that, with the signing the USMCA. In North America, we've got some more stability and consistency and things we can count on going forward, stability going forward. Understand a company's financial and operational constraints. Are you looking at short-term versus long-term progress? Where should the emphasis be? Constraints around capital spending or expenses, working capital, and human resources constraints, concerns around or constraints around bringing in more people, redeploying people. And then finally, looking at your supply chain network capacity, will it need to increase or decrease in the future, and company's manufacturing strategy in terms of a desire to maintain control of a manufacturing process in-house, very often for IP protection reasons. Next slide, Alex.
Dan, we had a question come up, and just for a housekeeping point of view, I'm assuming everyone knows this, but there's a button on there for you to ask questions, and we started getting questions from audience. We're going to take questions as we go, so please feel free to ask questions as we go. We already had one pop up, and Dan, specifically on the tariff issue, the question okay, it's a company, Michigan-based manufacturer. How do tariffs impact the location of potential new suppliers?
Well, certainly suppliers in China are going to be disadvantaged, at least in the near term. And what we've gravitated towards, we've had a lot of interest and success in looking at Southeast Asia, where you've got not just a large market and emerging economies, but you've got very established, stable trade relationships with the U.S. So minimal tariffs going between Southeast Asia and the U.S. and the ASEAN network of countries, minimal, if any, tariffs between moving products between those countries on their own. So that's one of the considerations we would look at.
And I guess the second consideration will be on the Mexico side, given the benefits now of the USMCA.
Yes, and the stability going forward and predictability of that. Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And if anyone has further questions, please feel free to continue to ask them. All right.
And so then after we understand more about your company, we do a deeper dive into your supply chain. What's your manufacturing footprint look like? Where are your manufacturing assets deployed? Their capacity? What are they highly utilized? Is there a need in the future for expansion or perhaps contraction? Do you have a history of regulatory compliance? You get some issues in some sites that might make them more difficult to maintain going forward. Internal planning functions. This is an area where many companies struggle with. How to get your demand forecasting aligned with your raw material planning, your production planning, and ultimately your ability to supply customers on time at an acceptable inventory level. Logistics strategy. What's your freight spend? Are you over reliant on expedited freight? Very often companies that are struggling to meet delivery timetables see their freight costs spiral out of control. Do you have effective carrier management processes? Have you got strategic partners from a logistics front that you can rely on and work with and get better over time? Inventory management, the value, the age of the inventory, where it's deployed versus where it's consumed. Some people look at future projections on some of your operations. Are you in an area where either labor availability or labor costs are going to be problematic in the future? Are you in areas where overhead costs have been escalating or likely to escalate? And then we talked a little bit about trade policy, looking for stable trade relationships. And then supplier performance. Who are your key suppliers? Where are they located? How are they doing from a quality delivery standpoint? Are they managing to stay ahead of inflation in terms of improving their productivity and being able to share those cost savings with you? Next slide, Alex. So, based on that information, our challenge is to look at that and develop a number of alternatives, options for improving the performance of your supply chain. And it could range from, labor and overhead savings, looking at potential for change in geographic locations, outsourcing logistics. Are you large enough, or where are you located? Is it likely to, there may be some benefit from going to a third-party logistics provider to have them manage your logistics, your warehousing, your order fulfillment processes, and really to develop a list of alternatives that can meet client requirements in terms of time to implement, cost to implement, resources required, and fundamentally what would be the return on those investments. Want to neck those down onto improvements that we think can be effectively implemented at a reasonable cost and show a good return. Next slide, Alex. And then once we've developed that, we would move on to develop a recommended course of action and meet with the executive team on a client, and really with the objective to facilitate a common understanding, a common agreement on the direction, how to go forward, what would be the path, which projects to undertake, the path for that, and an implementation plan to go along with that.
Dan, we had another question pop up, which is the question is, what is a should cost analysis?
That's where we maybe look at if it's in case of a raw material, understand what market price is, and whether how close the client's sourcing is to that market pricing. But more commonly, in many cases, if someone's buying a component or a more complicated material, using the expertise of manufacturing, supply chain, sourcing, manufacturing expertise of our people, evaluate what the purchase cost is versus most likely market pricing, and see how well you're buying, essentially.
Got it. Thank you.
So some of the types of recommendations that come out of an assessment, and these are ones that we've worked with clients to implement, and we'll talk some more about in the case studies, are identifying and qualifying new suppliers in Vietnam, an emerging region that's a lot of activity, a lot of information in the press, but it's not for everyone, and so you need to know your way around the landscape in Vietnam. For companies staying in China, developing of underperforming suppliers, working with suppliers to improve their cost, quality, on-time delivery performance, optimizing logistics management in China. China's a continental economy. It's a big country, and industrial activity is started to increase on the coast, in the coastal areas, but increasingly moving west. So increasingly more companies are faced with trying to figure out how to supply to the western part and the developing parts of that country. Established contract manufacturing in Mexico for a number of reasons: trade stability, proximity to a market, an established industrial base. Mexico makes a lot of sense for clients. Site selection and then relocation of supply chain and manufacturing into Southeast Asia, whether it's Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand. Each of those countries have specific areas of expertise, and we'll talk about a case in particular where we moved into Thailand, a significant project in Thailand. Next slide, Alex.
Dan, we had a question pop up around suppliers in Southeast Asia. It does EWA, other companies identifying suppliers in Southeast Asia? The answer is yeah. And then the question follows up on what is the likely differences between like a Vietnam and a Thailand? How do you rate those two different countries?
Well, it's around maturity, maturity of the manufacturing sector. Vietnam in particular, although it's changing rapidly and has developed a pretty impressive manufacturing base around electronics, computer hardware and equipment, by and large, most of the manufacturing is high labor component, and a lot of raw materials are coming in from China and tied to China. So there's not a deep supplier network in Vietnam for a lot of industries. Contrast that to Thailand, which has got a much more established manufacturing base, and so particularly with the automotive sector and the appliance manufacturing sector. So it would be, that would be a great fit for industries that aligned, that would be closely aligned with that. Those would be two key examples.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. But, having the right plan, identifying the right is half the story. Really, the next piece, the implementation piece of that is key to this, and very difficult, and it's an area where East West specializes in. Next slide, please. First of all, supply chain optimization and making a change is complex, and when it's done wrong, it can cause a significant disruption, and nobody wants that. And it's a huge challenge to make these changes. But when it's done right, with a seamless transition to a future state, the benefits can be huge. The right implementation requires breadth of experience and breadth of services. We've talked a lot about East-West services across, commercial aspects and supply chain, but experience on the ground, people that have been there for years, understand operations and understand how to manage in a different culture. So the key is experienced people on the ground. Next slide, please. So, we've talked about companies that are looking to expand beyond China. Some of the projects that we've been involved in and the tasks we've been involved with, listed here for companies that look to go beyond China into Asia, Southeast Asia, Mexico, Central Europe. We've highlighted some of the ones that we'll talk about in the case studies. It could be identifying the appropriate country and region for new suppliers. I mentioned the contrast and compare Vietnam to Thailand a minute ago. That would be an indicator of that. Identification and qualification of new suppliers in those regions. Appropriate site selection for a new operation, new factory, and then once that's done, manage the design, the construction, fit out, hiring, staffing at those new sites. Make versus buy analysis, evaluating what's appropriate for your company to produce, or what might be a candidate for outsourcing of contract manufacturing of some of your products. And then also looking at logistics. I mentioned logistics in China being very important, growing importance. Developing a logistics strategy in a new region if you're moving outside of China. It's where perhaps less developed. And for companies that are staying in China for China, done quite a bit of work with auditing and assessing of existing suppliers, and then in the case of underperforming ones, developing those suppliers. We've also done some work on process improvement in factories. It could be application of lean and Six Sigma principles, and then do factory retrofit to support that improvement. Looking at performance improvement of your overall supply chain, very much part of the planning functions, but also identifying and implementing KPIs to be monitored, and setting up systems to monitor those in an existing supply chain or an operation. And again, mention logistics strategy in China to optimize that, particularly as your customer base may be expanding, growing, and moving away from the traditional areas along the eastern seaboard that you need to serve. So, next slide. So we've got 4 case studies coming up. First 2 will focus on companies that are looking to move beyond China, well established in China, looking to make a move. In the first case is a company we worked with that was sourcing about $150 million a year from a supplier network in China. And they'd been doing this for years. It was well established. They had a sourcing office and team on the ground that could provide technical support, engineering assistance, quality assurance oversight to a supplier network. but they were hit with tariffs, and they'd also been hit over the years with escalating costs that had been squeezing margins. So the board was looking at this trend and became concerned about the heavy reliance upon China. Things from a delivery and a quality and product performance standpoint, things had gone very well for them, but the margins had eroded, and it had just been they were too dependent on China, and had set the target to relocate 25% of this sourcing outside of China, and gave them a very aggressive time, 9 months. So East West was engaged to work with them to develop a strategy and execute a strategy to expand their sourcing beyond China. And after the assessment phase, there were really two key pieces to it, two key tasks, key work streams. First was to shift the sourcing of one product line to Vietnam from China. And as we were starting to work with the client and understand their supplier base, and looking at other suppliers, other similar suppliers in China, came across a couple that had previously relocated some of their manufacturing into Vietnam. And this started in high labor component industries more than 5 years ago. So the number of Chinese manufacturers that led the charge moving into Vietnam. The second piece of this was to explore Mexico for contract manufacturing of some of their key product lines. We also looked at for them to set up their own operation and manufacture the products in Mexico, but it determined that the scale of their operation wasn't quite there to justify a full-blown investment. And the most likely best step would be to begin working with contract manufacturers closer to home in Mexico. And then additionally, another area that came out as we were doing understand the supply base in China, the supplier landscape in China. We identified a few other suppliers that we think might be competitive on an ongoing basis, but as the focus was really on moving outside of China, this was put on the back burner that we come back to later after the shift in sourcing. The implementation, East West people led a supplier evaluation, shortlisted suppliers, did supplier visits and audits, worked with the suppliers to develop prototypes and costing samples to make sure they were capable. And then once we'd identified capable suppliers, we also went in and looked at the logistics. With the increase in manufacturing activity in Vietnam the last several years, the demand for logistics services has sort of outpaced the availability of transport, import, export, and transport. So we were able to identify capable and competent logistics providers, part of this, to be able to make sure they could not only source the product but get it to their markets. In Mexico, we identified and worked and qualified contract manufacturers that were producing similar products that they could tweak to meet the client's specifications. And then as we were dealing with multiple contract manufacturers, we engaged a third-party logistics provider to provide support on the ground for warehousing, load consolidation, transport management for shipments of the products into the U.S., into the distribution centers and customers. The impact of that was that they could reduce inventories, eliminate all that inventory on the water, which allowed them to shut down a distribution center, reduce the amount of warehousing space they needed, as we took that amount of inventory out of the supply chain. And the results being it's about $700,000 a year savings on freight and warehousing costs, a substantial more than $6 million savings on tariffs, and an inventory reduction, cash freed up of $2.3 million. And so the project costs were recovered very quickly, less than 6 months. We were able to meet the aggressive 9-month schedule, and the transition went quite smoothly. We were able to coordinate the transition from the China suppliers to the Vietnam and Mexico suppliers without a major disruption. So,
hey Dan, we had a question, another question pop up, which was around contract manufacturing in Mexico. The question was, company Pennsylvania, manufacturing, for contract manufacturing in Mexico, what are the core things to look out for? Apparently, this person answering the question has had some challenges or had come across some bad contract manufacturers. Apparently, had some bad experience with them.
Okay, a number of things. Understand, it's important to understand the industrial, sort of the industrial base, the ecosystem. Make sure you're located or looking in a place that's got similar suppliers, so you be confident that there's capability, there's people capability there. Even though the USMCA makes things easier, there's still complicated taxation issues, and so you want to make sure that that your contract manufacturers are very capable of manufacturing and exporting into the U.S. market rather than being heavily focused on the domestic market. So that's a skill set they'll need to have. And then to understand logistics costs, because one of the things we've seen in the last couple of years is what we think is opportunistic pricing on transport logistics. There used to be a much wider differential between transport from Asia to the U.S. versus Mexico to the U.S. That gap is narrowed, and so to be very aware of that and factor that into your cost projections and where you locate. So.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Mark.
Sure, thank you, Dan. So I'm sorry. So this also is one about leaving China, and it incorporates both a manufacturing and a supply chain setting up. This was a large USA company who had an operation in Guangdong province. It was underperforming. The margins were decreasing. Why? Because of higher labor costs, compliance costs, and then of course competition in China, and then also the exports to the U.S. were being affected heavily by the tariffs. So East West was engaged to develop and implement an operational and sourcing strategy to restore financial stability. And as I said, this was to include, as much as moving the whole factory to only perhaps keeping the factory, moving the supply chain outside of China, et cetera, et cetera. We did an assessment based on the current state analysis, and we'll go through this in just a moment. East West developed, our plan was they should exit China and exit not only from just sourcing components, but really moving your manufacturing base outside of China. And couple of the big drivers, the biggest driver was the fact that of that factory in China, only 20% of it was really staying in China. So they were in China having all the headaches that you can have with China now, higher labor rates, tax incentives have gone away, tariffs from there back to the USA, China 2025, less transparency, et cetera, and getting very few of the benefits, which that is selling in China. And there wasn't China, again, also because of that, it wasn't big enough to have a China +1 strategy where you'd keep your factory in China and then add another one outside. So our assessment was to relocate all sourcing and manufacturing to ASEAN. And as we mentioned earlier, ASEAN is 600-700 million people. GDP is 5-6-7%, a young population, and ASEAN is particularly nice because then we don't have duty issues going back to the States. We have free flow of goods within ASEAN, and there's great growth in ASEAN. So next slide, please, Alex.
Sure.
So implementing. So we decided, okay, we need to do a third country, a multi-country study. And as you can see, it was 5 countries plus China, 6, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand. As you can imagine, we put together a weighted matrix of the important things that typically you'd think of: incentives, taxes, labor costs, availability of suppliers, how big is the market size, is it growing, transportation in, transportation out, And our recommendation was Thailand. And Thailand it's highly, as we mentioned earlier, it's highly developed. It's got a great manufacturing base for autos, appliances, HVAC. Having lived in Thailand in the early 90s, I used to say that Thailand was China before China was China. All the infrastructure is there. It's moving south to some degree. New airports in the south. So great infrastructure and logistics hubs for ASEAN in and out. And also really interesting, Thailand has a 150-year-old treaty with the United States, Treaty of Amity, which by treaty and by law guarantees fast access to the states and very competitive tariffs. So Thailand was felt to be very good. However, before we wanted to introduce the client, we worked with the Thailand Board of Investment for incentives. As you can imagine, they're very important, and we understood from the Thai Board of Investment what would attract companies, and training, highly educated workforce. They would like to have us hire design labs, technical labs, et cetera, et cetera. In addition, next slide, please, Alex.
Mark, there's a question popped up here. Question says, talks about you've got the weighted areas of focus here for supply chain and manufacturing. Supply chain, established manufacturing base, suppliers, good suppliers, raw materials, finished goods. The question was, when you're evaluating suppliers in these countries, I assume you're talking about the multi-country search there, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, and Thailand. The question was, how do you go about doing due diligence on these different suppliers? How do you find the suppliers? How do you do the due diligence?
Sure. No, good question. Good question. Well, again, in the case that we just use Thailand as an example, or the Philippines, Indonesia would be very similar. We already know that there's a pretty established general manufacturing supply base. Then, of course, we do desktop early on. Then we shortlist from desktop, and then we send our people in, or ourselves go in. We give basic specs from our client to let them look at the drawings, get an understanding, see if they think it's something they could work on. Ask for preliminary pricing based on some volumes, estimated volumes. If that looks good, go visit them. Check with other resources, the American Chamber of Commerce, other non-competing companies. In the case of Thailand, we spent a lot of time with Caterpillar, Harley Davidson, and Johnson Controls, because they were similar companies but not competitors, and that's how we were able to find out a lot about local component suppliers. So
the follow-up question from someone said, how do you know if your potential supplier, this is in Asia, and I guess this would apply to Asia or Mexico or even Central Eastern Europe, how do you know if your potential supplier is as he appears, related to honesty, integrity, has legal concerns? So I guess how do you evaluate them?
Yeah, no, very, very good question. So you have your operational due diligence. You go to the facility, you walk around, you get samples, all that kind of stuff. That's pretty straightforward. We also have a service we do a lot of is kind of overt, where we're able to investigate the owners of the potential suppliers, and then do checks on them as far as outstanding lawsuits, any problems with the government, and all that is, a lot is publicly available. So we not only do the due diligence on the operational side, we do it on the ownership side. And sometimes you do it because you have 3 suppliers and they look like they're pretty good. Then you begin to do your homework and you find out that the same person owns all 3 of the potential suppliers. So you have to do, it's kind of legal and personal due diligence along with operational due diligence. It's critical.
Thank you.
So as I was saying, this particular case and this client, we were doing 2 things for them. We were moving a manufacturing location, and we were also having to develop a new supplier base to support, because it was more of it wasn't so vertically integrated. They were doing a lot of assembly from component suppliers. So working with the Thailand Board of Investment, we went and visited a tremendous amount of suppliers. We began to then look for samples and pricing and technical requirements, things that, begin to shortlist potential suppliers, because we had to eventually move all our suppliers from China to Thailand over about an 18-month period. And then we had to shortlist suppliers. We brought the client in their sourcing group and had major visits with the top 10 suppliers, the 90% of the suppliers, to make sure we had the proper supply base in country. And then in addition, of course, we had to build a facility. We had to find the local zones, negotiate tax incentives, find project managers, hire architects and engineers, as well as general contractors, and then manage the facility. And the facility was 250,000 square feet, hiring 300 people with test centers and design labs. And the test centers and design labs were particularly important for Thailand Board of Investment to get the highest possible tax incentives that we could. Next page, please, Alex. And then the short of it is, because we were able to bring in test centers and design labs and hire qualified engineers, mechanical engineers, we were able to obtain for the client an 8-year tax holiday of corporate income tax, meaning no tax at all for 8 years and 50% for 5 years. Well, and the reason that's so critical is many operations, when you start them up the first 3 years, you're not making any money anyway, so your tax holidays don't do you really any good. So having 8 years gives you 5 years then when you're up and running, and then additional 5 years at 50%. And as compared to if they would have stayed in China and paid the taxes that they would have paid in China, over 10 years, they estimated a $22 million tax savings. Over 5 years, they anticipated an annual labor savings of 4.3 million, because Thailand's labor is half the rate that China is. And for perspective, and what Dan was talking about, labor intensive, Vietnam is again about half of what Thailand is. So the labor rates have come down from what they were as compared to China 25 years ago. A big thing we found was close to $2 million in material savings. And why was that? Well, one of the main reasons is the suppliers that we begin to work with are also Board of Investment companies, and they in turn were getting tax incentives from the Board of Investment and be able to pass those savings on to our client. So thinking that we would maybe have to pay more for our components and raw materials in Thailand as compared to China, we're actually paying less. Then, of course, being down there in the middle of ASEAN, we were closer to our market, so we had freight savings of $120. And, of course, annual tariff savings back to the States of $3 million. As I said, Thailand is a treaty partner of the United States with the Treaty of Amity, and allows for very competitive tariffs coming in as low as 0. So long and short of it is, as their pro forma compared to what they would have done in China, they increased their sales forecast for 5 years, 42%, and their profit estimates based on higher volume and lower costs was increased 53% over their initial plan with China for 5 years. So all in all, is a very good program for both component sourcing and moving a manufacturing location.
All right.
Okay. I'll take over and a little switch in direction. The first 2 case studies talked about companies that were looking to move beyond China, move beyond their established supply chains or manufacturing, and move outside of China. We'll talk about 2 examples of companies that were in China for the domestic market, but needed some help improving certain aspects of their supply chain to remain competitive. The first case was a specialty chemicals manufacturer, U.S. company that had a single factory in China, in the eastern part of the country. The company had been there quite a while and started very small and had grown the business. And quite honestly, the growth of the business had really past their ability to manage their logistics and supply chain processes. So they come to a point where they had very high inventory levels, but their on-time delivery performance was poor, and they were paying expedited freight for almost 60% of their shipments to get it to customers on time because they were always behind. They'd set up multiple warehouses across the country to try to solve the problem. And they made some progress with that, but when you do that, you almost inevitably increase your inventories. And so the inventory levels had, again, gotten out of control. So East West came in to work with them to evaluate their logistics and inventory management processes to try to develop an improvement plan, and successfully developed an improvement plan for them. Key parts of that, key items coming out of that assessment was, first of all, they had too many carriers. They were dealing with more than 50 carriers to move product. It was very much dealing with spot relationships, and none really had a comprehensive service agreement. They didn't have agreements on performance, and they didn't do enough business with any of them to have significant price negotiation leverage. The planning processes around production planning, inventory management were generally manual. They relied on spreadsheets, and they were people dependent rather than system dependent. So when you had a change in personnel, if someone left or someone transferred to a new job, you had to come up the learning curve again, and you inevitably had hiccups in the supply operation. And then from a supply chain organization standpoint, you had people along the different aspects of the supply chain, whether or not it was production planning or raw material management and sourcing, customer service, warehouse operations, logistics planning. They very often reported into different departments in the organization. So the coordination was not very good, and they didn't share the same KPIs and same performance objectives. Next slide, Alex. So in the implementation, once we'd identified areas that need improvement, East West managed the implementation for the client. First thing was to tackle the logistics. We developed a request for a quote for outbound logistics services, with the intent to develop a primary carrier that could handle the majority of the shipments. And we identified, qualified a carrier that could handle 80% of the outbound loads, which would allow us to include KPIs and performance expectations into the contract, ongoing carrier management monitoring programs, and provide an opportunity to negotiate favorable pricing based on that volume. We looked at the organization design, as mentioned, and really realigned the organization into a supply chain supporting organization, and assigned an interim supply chain manager very early on to direct the implementation. And that person was eventually replaced by a permanent hire, but during the interim, so we could maintain momentum, we had someone there on an interim basis. And then we focused, part of that, in addition to the logistics management, focused on the planning processes to make them more transparent, be very clear, less personnel dependent, and really on forecasting demand, raw material supplies, inventory management, production planning. These were all redesigned, and common KPIs were set up and established, and trained and training set up for the new systems and people in new systems. And we achieved pretty good results. Freight and warehousing cost savings of about $300,000, reduced the number of warehouses in the network while continuing to improve service, reduced the number of expedited freight orders from 57% down to 14%. On-time delivery performance improved from 60% to up over 90%. And this was all achieved within 9 months. And then an inventory reduction, so freed up $1.9 million in cash on top of this. So pretty successful project for us. Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, and this is the last case study. This also is about staying in China and improving your operation. A client, fast moving consumer goods, came to us. They were in the process of buying a large company, but that had an entity in southern China. And they wanted us to come in and do a two-phase approach to really do a supplier review, because they didn't have time to do it. They were going to have us do a quick review on the front end, an assessment, and then put together a post-acquisition, how to bring it in line. And typically we would have done both on the front end, but they were under a lot of pressure to make the acquisition, and they wanted us to give them both some ideas on the front end and then be able to help them fix the problems on the back end. So our assessment really with the suppliers that were supporting this new operation in China was they had weak quality control, and as they were smaller suppliers who had been supplying mostly Chinese organizations, and really weren't sure sometimes of the quality control of the ingredients. They also had, we thought they had weak systems as far as managing their inventory control and product being rotated in and out as required. And as you can imagine, in China, they had some questionable relations between the agents and the Chinese customs officials and the suppliers. So there was some potential, and then also some potential irregularities in compliance by the Chinese suppliers as to how they were paying their employees, their taxes, their health and welfare. And then there's also a concern about quality control measures as it pertained to their clean rooms and their standard operating procedures. Next slide, please, Alex. First thing we wanted to do was we wanted to get in was to begin to counsel the client regarding these interactions with the agents and suppliers, because they had already had suppliers around for quite a while and they weren't traveling as much. But now with these new suppliers who weren't used to working with USA multinationals, it took more hands-on. We had to then provide them with ethics and business practice training to get the suppliers and agents up to speed. Also, we had to develop standard operating procedures for the clean room and other raw material handling to make sure they were, because this was a medical product that had a lot of issues they had to take care of. And then we had to initiate with some statistical process controls to make sure they could track the improvements as they made them. So the results post acquisition was, after 12 months, we were able to get the above average ratings of all the suppliers up. Suppliers, their self-reporting was up, and to the agents, as well as their measurements for statistical process controls, and throughput was 30% from baseline, which also was and helped it with the contamination issues. And overall first pass quality measures for the suppliers was up 43%. And after a year, we were able to reduce the waste and spoilage for the product costs of approximately 15%, or about 3.2 million. So getting in, working closely with the suppliers on the ground who had not worked a lot in the past with USA multinationals, we were able to turn these suppliers around and get them up to speed, so they were in accordance with the standard operating procedures of the new parent. So all in all, a good project.
Yeah, and we've got Mark got a quick question here about what do you look for when you're developing a distribution strategy? You talked about that in the earlier case study.
Yeah, well, again,
in Mexico.
Yeah, in this case, that they had agents already in place, and they were going with agents then to distributors, depending on your markets. A lot of times, and my vast background has pretty been dealing direct, manufacturing to either to distributors and or dealers, and that way you have a tighter direct connect with the end customer. Geographically, sometimes if you're in China now specifically, and you're doing a lot of business out west, you have smaller markets and longer travel times. Then agents and distributors become more valuable if you're out in Xinjiang or Chongqing or Chengdu, where they can handle the warehousing for you. They can also handle the credit and collections that typically would be harder to handle with some of the smaller clients further west. So a lot of it's geographic driven, a lot of it is financially driven, whether you go direct to the dealers or you go through agents and distributors to your dealers. And typically, as I said, further west you go, quite often you have distributors because of smaller markets and longer supply chains.
All right, well, thank you. And I hope we tried to get as many questions as we could today. Want to thank everybody. It's 1 hour, so we want to hop off. We have 2 upcoming webinars. We're giving one. We've been asked to give an association with corporate growth that's specifically geared toward portfolio companies of private equity firms and the effect that a lot of them are China dominated in their sourcing and manufacturing, and it's lowering valuations. And that's on the 19th of November, and the one on the 17th of November is specifically for our clients and for other companies who have existing plans, existing strategies for their supply chain. And then the question is there a good projected ROI? And can this properly be implemented? We'll send you notifications of those, but give you a save the date notice. At that point, it's 12 o'clock. It's 1 hour, so we will thank you all. Appreciate you all attending, and we'll look forward to, if you have any questions, please feel free to give us a call. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.